So just explain what this amendment is all about, and do you think you've got the numbers to win?
It's all about MPs having a vote on the government's policy before it comes into force and takes away people's civil liberties. So members of parliament are feeling increasingly helpless as their constituents complain about real impacts on their lives, their jobs, their prosperity, indeed their health, which come from the side effects of COVID measures. So we're not proposing to take the power from ministers to decide what's done or take away the power of the business of the House of Commons. None of those worst fears. We're just saying that the government should use the procedure that puts a statutory instrument before the House for a debate and the decision. In a sense, I'm saying MPs should be sharing in the dreadful burden of decision in these circumstances and not just retrospectively being asked to approve what the government's done. And to answer your question, yeah, there are plenty of MPs who would vote for this amendment if it is selected, and we think it will be selected. It's really down to Labour, the SNP and the Liberal Democrats if it comes to it. I have to say, we don't really want a rebellion. We're trying to support the government in getting this done by saying, let us vote on these measures and support the government. Let's have policy which enjoys our consent.
So if the opposition parties do back the amendment, Labour, the Lib Dems, etc., do you think you've got the numbers to get it through?
I'm certain at the moment, but that's really, as I say, we would prefer to avoid this coming to a division. I'm afraid it's in the nature of the way Parliament works that things happen like this. But I back Boris Johnson. I want him to succeed. But we do need to share with the government the burden of decision on these measures and not just come in, days or weeks later retrospectively, perhaps voting on measures which have subsequently been amended. It's been a nonsense. You look at the Public Health Act 1984, measures came in. By the time we voted on them, they'd been changed once or twice. And we had Charles Walker, former head of the Procedure Committee, he wouldn't mind me saying, stood up in the House of Commons and wasn't sure which measure he was voting on. Well, if somebody who's chaired the Procedure Committee can't be sure, well, then we're into a nonsense position where MPs' democratic consent for really important draconian policy has ended up being missing. So we're trying to put this right. And actually, it's a very modest proposal that MPs should vote on law before it comes into effect and takes away people's liberties.
You say it's a modest proposal, you say you're trying to share the burden, but at the same time, if there's anything that the last 6 months or so has told us, it's how fast this virus can move. Is there not a risk that your amendment effectively slows the government down? It stops it from taking that very quick action which might be necessary in the fight against COVID-19?
Well, we need a solution that does allow for that fast and effective action, which also rules out any possibility of mischief from the Labour Party, but which also gives MPs ordinarily the opportunity to vote before things come into action. But I think if everybody reflects on what has happened, the Prime Minister's made announcements about what's to come into effect days later. There really has been time now for measures to be properly debated. I think at the time we put the Coronavirus Act through, you could see that it was an emergency. In the reasonable worst case of the time, we needed to just get that act through, and it was an awful thing to face. But now we're much further along. Now treatments have improved. Now there's more testing. There is time to have a debate on a statutory instrument. We're only really talking about a 2-hour debate on a statutory instrument with no amendments to that instrument. That's the way it works. Vote on it. If Parliament votes for it, then the Minister can sign it into law. And this is the normal procedure. And I think we need to reach an agreement with the government whereby if it was a genuine emergency, they could act on what's called the made affirmative procedure. But I'm afraid this is very procedural. But there really is a scope here to solve the problem. We've done it before with the EU Withdrawal Act. We can do it now.
I'm interested to get your thoughts a bit more broadly on some of the measures and the direction that the government is going in. I noticed you used the word draconian in the interview a bit earlier. You previously said it's time for us to actually start living like a free people, not subjecting ourselves to constantly shifting legal requirements. What exactly do you mean? What are your concerns?
Well, 100 Acts of Parliament have been used to put in place, I think it's 242 statutory instruments. The Telegraph has reported, I think it was yesterday, that there have been 200 changes. Well, when you've got a body of law that large, changing that fast, I doubt really anyone understands what that law is, much beyond the people who wrote the frequently asked questions available on the gov.uk website, which now run to 22 pages when you print them. So we're in an environment where you really can't know whether you're a criminal or not with this much law coming into force and changing so fast. And that's why I've said this is not a fit environment for free people.
So you don't feel that we're being treated like a free people at the minute?
That's what I'm saying. Absolutely, yes. I mean, how do people think that liberty dies? It dies like this, with government exercising draconian powers without parliamentary scrutiny in advance, undermining the rule of law by having a shifting blanket of rules that no one can understand. I mean, it's extremely serious. I don't think I look like a hysterical person to you. I'm saying that this is a very serious moment. Rishi Sunak brought up this issue that we need to learn to live without fear. At the moment, the public are being deliberately told that they should be afraid. The idea, I think the phrase used was that the sense of personal risk needed to be raised. Well, the government's been frightening people into compliance, and it hasn't been working. If you look at figures from King's College, the figures for how the proportion of people isolating if they've got COVID symptoms are very low. I think it's 18%. You know, this isn't working, trying to frighten people. And actually, what we need to do is all grow up and try and live a bit more virtuously, have a bit more faith, hope, courage, temperance, prudence, all those great virtues which actually make a society one worth having. So that's why I want government to come to Parliament, give MPs a vote before things come into effect, and let us share in the burden of decision and represent our constituents, which is what we're elected to do.
At the same time, though, infection numbers are going one way at the minute, and all the evidence suggests that the government has actually got the public's backing on a lot of the restrictions that it's put in place. According to a YouGov survey this week, 78% of people support the government's new measures. So are you actually on the wrong side of the argument here?
Well, no, but this is the thing about surveys versus what people actually do. And I know what the surveys say, and I also know what the King's College evidence says about compliance. I'm afraid there is a disconnect between people's intentions and what they actually do. And that's really what I'm pointing to. I'm well aware of the case numbers going up, and I'm well aware that this is a dangerous disease for people with comorbidities. But I'm also well aware that for people under the age of 60 without other pre-existing conditions, it is not an especially dangerous disease, and this is one of the cruelties of it. So I'm very interested in listening to your debate between scientists. Scientists are only human too. There is a range of interpretations available on the data that we have. I think it's very important that we're really practical and realistic about science in this kind of environment of uncertainty. And we have to balance the cost of lockdown, the cost of these measures, against the cost of the disease.
OK.
And the Department of Health's own figures show that lockdown's been more expensive than the disease.
Very quickly, because we are running out of time, do you think that Boris Johnson should listen a bit more to his Chancellor then?
Well, I want the two of them to succeed as a team. I've got great admiration for them both. In a sense, what we need is Boris back with his bounce, with his mojo. He's got a great Chancellor in Rishi, and I support them both.
OK, and just finally, there are reports this morning that Paul Dacre, the former editor of the Daily Mail, a critic of the BBC, is Boris Johnson's top choice for the job of Ofcom chairman. Is that an appointment you'd welcome?
Of course it is, yes, I'd be delighted. And of course, I'd like to see Charles Moore go in as chairman of the BBC. I think this would be great news. And I think anyone suggesting we were somehow appointing our preferred people needs to look at the record of others who've been appointed to these roles and try to be a bit, again, more realistic about politics and policy and who should be appointed by governments.
Why would it be great news then?
Well, because they're Conservatives, and they might actually start to look at the way the media functions and ensure there's some impartiality. I can assure you that from my point of view, time and again during interviews, I've felt that there was a consensus thought on the side of the broadcaster, which was not on the side of moderate mainstream conservatism. So I look forward to them perhaps being appointed and being a bit more conservative and pragmatic in what is reported.